All right, multiplication with negative numbers. Recall that multiplication is a way of writing repeated addition. So 4 times 7 means that you've added 7 to itself 4 times. 4 times 7 is 28. So 3 times negative 5 is negative 5 added to itself 3 times. Negative 5 plus negative 5 plus negative 5 is negative 15. So a positive number times a positive number is going to be positive. A positive number times a negative number is going to be negative because you're adding a negative that many times. Positive times a positive is positive. A positive times a negative is negative. And then from before, recall that multiplication is commutative. So 7 times 3 is the same thing as 3 times 7. So that means that if a positive times a negative is negative, then a negative times a positive is negative, because that would be commutative. That means that 5 times negative 7 is the same thing as negative 7 times 5. Either way, you get negative 35. Multiplying a negative by a negative is a little harder to justify. One way you can think of it is by saying, I didn't not eat your cupcake. So a double negative makes a positive. Another way to think of it is that everything in math has to fit a pattern. For example, 3 times negative 5 is negative 15. 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. 1 times negative 5 is negative 5. 0 times negative 5 is 0. So what would come next? Well, as we decrease the multiplier, our answer increases by how much? Well, if you increase by 5 each time, what would I get here? Negative 1 times negative 5 will be 5. Negative 2 times negative 5 is 10. So a negative times a negative is going to be positive. We actually used this rule earlier when we talked about the negative of a number. In math, of means times. So negative of a negative is a negative times a negative. So the negative of negative 3 is positive 3. That's the same thing as multiplying negative 1 times negative 3. Let's do some examples. All right, let's remember our order of operations. You want to do any operation that's inside the parentheses first. We have -7 and +2. They have different signs, so you find the difference and their absolute values. So 7 minus 2 is 5, but you keep the sign of the larger. And because the result is negative, you want to leave it inside the parentheses. So it'll look like this. -8 plus 3. And remember, the 3 is touching the parentheses, so that means multiply. So the 3 is being multiplied by -5. So you have an addition here and a multiplication. We want to do the multiplication next. +3 times -5. A positive times a negative is negative. And there's two different ways of writing this. You can either write -8 plus -15, which is kind of how I want you to think about it, because you're adding two numbers with the same sign. But eventually you'll write it like this: -8 minus 15. But you want to remember that you're adding two numbers with the same sign, so you add 8 and 15 to get 23. But since you're adding a negative and a negative, the result is negative. Let's do another example. So let's simplify. -2 times the result of 3 minus 9 plus 5 times the result of -2 minus 4. And you might want to hit pause and try to work it out on your own before looking at the answer. Okay, so according to the order of operations, we simplify the inside of the parentheses if there's an operation inside the parentheses. So we have +3 plus -9. Those have different signs. So we subtract 3 from 9. The result is going to be negative. And because the result of an operation inside the parentheses is negative, it's safest to keep it inside parentheses. There's times when you don't need to keep the parentheses, but if you're ever unsure, you want to keep those parentheses. All right, let's bring down the plus sign. Then we have 5 multiplied by the result of this parentheses. This is -2 plus -4. Those have the same sign, so we find the sum and keep the sign. So 2 plus 4 is 6, and because they're both negative, the result is negative. Because the result is negative, we keep it inside the parentheses. All right, and now we're going to multiply. So here we have a negative times a negative. It's going to be +12. And then we're going to add a positive times a negative, which is going to be negative. You can write it this way, or you could simply write 12 minus 30. Those mean the same thing. So we're adding numbers with different signs. So we subtract their absolute values. Take 12 away from 30, and we get 18. But because the number with a larger absolute value is negative, the result is going to be negative. Let's do some more. So first, let's do the operation inside the parentheses. +7 plus -9 is -2. So we'll bring down the minus. And because the result of the parentheses is negative, we're going to keep the parentheses. And now I have a multiplication. Negative 5 times positive 2 is negative 10. And we could do this at the same time, but let's take a moment. And let's talk about it first. So you recall that the negative of a negative makes that a positive. But first you need to ask yourself, are these being multiplied or not? And because the 10 is not touching the parentheses, when you do the negative of a negative, that becomes a plus. So negative 10 and positive 2 makes negative 8. Let's do another one. All right, let's simplify this one. And like before, if you want to hit pause and try it on your own before watching me do it, that would be awesome. All right, there's a lot going on here, so let's just take a moment and talk about it. So whenever you have an operation inside parentheses, you do that first. And these square brackets are just like any other parentheses, but it's just visually easier to see that this one goes with this one. So inside of the parentheses, you do this operation first. So first we'll simplify the negative of a negative. And because the 5 is touching the parentheses, the 5 is being multiplied by this result. We have negative 15 minus 2, 3 minus 5, and then the negative of negative 2 is positive 2. And because it's positive, I can just go ahead and take away the parentheses. And then inside the parentheses, we want to multiply next. We have negative 15 minus 2, 3 minus 10. We're still simplifying the inside of the parentheses. So we have positive 3 and negative 10. They have different signs. So we find the difference. Take 3 away from 10, which gives us 7. But then we keep the sign of the number with a larger absolute value. So that's going to be negative 7. So if you wrote negative 7 here, it would look like they were being subtracted. But the 2 is touching this parentheses, so they're multiplied. So you need to keep the parentheses or bracket. All right. So these are being subtracted, and these are multiplied. So you want to do negative 2 times negative 7. And then let's take a moment before we write the next step. So negative 2 times negative 7 is 14. Is it going to be negative 15 plus 14 or negative 15 times 14? And the key is here. Are these touching? And the answer is no. So you'll write negative 15 plus 14. And then they have different signs. So we find the difference. Take 14 from 15, which will be 1. But this one has a larger absolute value, so we keep the sign. You'll recall that exponents are a way of writing repeated multiplication. So we need to talk about exponents and negative numbers. I'm going to show you two examples. You may want to memorize these two examples because this is going to come up a lot. All right, I'll tell you the proper way of saying this in English. This is -3, the quantity, squared. This is the negative of 5 squared. So -3, the quantity, squared. If the negative is inside the parentheses, then the negative gets repeated. So -3 squared is -3 times -3. A negative times a negative is positive. The negative of 5 squared, that's just the negative of 5 times 5. So if the negative is not inside the parentheses, it's not repeated. So we get -5 times 5. A negative times a positive is negative. So this is the part you need to memorize. If the negative is inside the parentheses, it gets repeated. If the negative is not inside the parentheses, it's not repeated. Only the number is repeated. Let's do a couple of examples. All right, so from the order of operations, you recall that if there's an operation inside the parentheses, you do that first. -8 and +6 make -2. And because the result is negative, we'll keep the parentheses. And then you want to do this exponent before this multiplication. And because the negative is inside the parentheses, that negative gets repeated. So this is 5 times -2 times -2. That's a negative times a negative, so that'll be +4, which is 20. All right, let's try another one. And again, if you want to try it, hit pause and try it before I talk about it. That would be awesome. All right, this one's pretty challenging. I'm sure some of y'all are tempted by this negative of a negative. But what you want to recall is that negative of a negative is a multiplication. And in the order of operations, first you do the parentheses, then the exponent, then you do a multiplication. So in this case, we'll simplify the inside of the parentheses first. -2 and +7 have different signs. So we subtract, and that's going to be +5. So I'm going to bring down this minus. The result of this operation is positive, so I no longer need the parentheses. It's just going to look like this. So now that we've simplified the parentheses, now we're going to do the exponent. And you take a moment and you go, is this negative repeated? Well, the answer is no, because this negative is not inside the parentheses. So this is just -8 minus 5 times 5. Only the 5 gets repeated. 5 times 5 is 25. So it's negative 8 minus 25. Or you can rewrite it as negative 8 plus negative 25. So it's a negative plus a negative. We're going to find the sum, but we keep the sign.